Hello, my name is Perry Jones. I'm a hydrologist. I work for the US Geological Survey, and I'll present today some of the groundwater issues with the Northeast metro area. And just to let everyone know what we're looking at, it doesn't work so well. That's why I brought another one. That one's not working very well. Anyway, we're talking area basically from about Forest Lake down to North St. Paul, then over to Shoreview, and then over to Big Marine Lake in Grant Township. And so with this presentation, I'm hoping to address three questions. Thanks. One is, where does our water come from? The water we drink, where is it coming from? And then, where does the groundwater, or the well water we pump, come from? And then finally, why do we see in some lakes in the Northeast Metro, we see the water levels low, while in other lakes, they're high, and we don't see any impact? There we go. So, where is the water we use coming from? In the Northeast Metro, most of the water we're using is coming from groundwater. There are two different types of wells. We have high capacity wells and we have lower capacity users. And the high capacity users are ones which we have wells that pump more than 1 million gallons per year. And these typically are municipalities as well as large commercial operations and golf courses. And what we can see from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources takes records and keeps records for these water withdrawals from these wells that and for the communities. We see that 99% of that water is coming from wells or groundwater, whereas about 1% just comes from lakes or nearby rivers. When we're looking at the lower capacity users, these are typically domestic wells, private wells, small commercial operations. These we don't have as good a handle on where the water use is coming from because they don't keep records of the pumping conditions from those, because they're typically less than 1 million gallons per year. But from just looking in the area, we have a feeling that it's approximately about 100% is from groundwater. Now, where's the groundwater coming from? And again, I think what we have to do is to look and see what the situation is to basically take a knife and slice through an area of the Northeast Metro. And I picked an area at White Bear Lake because that's where we've recently done our studies. So if we take a slice through and go down and look what the aquifer system looks like below White Bear Lake's in the blue at the top. But then right below that, we have a lot of glacial material. It's called glacial till. A lot of it is sands and clays and other material that was deposited by the glaciers when they came through this area. But below that are some bedrock aquifers, or aquifers of sandstone, limestone, and a variety of other sedimentary rocks that are much older than the glacial material. And in the area, directly below the glacial tills, in a lot of areas we see the St. Peter sandstone. And then below that we have what's called the Prairie du Chien group and the Jordan sandstone. Now those two units make up a major aquifer in the area. And so when people are looking at putting in wells, they'll often put in a well, and what you can see is they'll try to key in on certain aquifers. If it's a major municipality, they try to get aquifers that provide a lot of water, and typically the Jordan and the Prairie du Chien provide a lot of water. If it's for a domestic purpose, for a house well or something, you may look at putting into a glacial material, some of the glacial sands, or maybe into the St. Peter sandstone. Now, if we look at the sources of water, what was heavily used in the area for the municipal wells or the high capacity wells, typically we look at the Prairie du Chien, limestones, and the Jordan sandstone. Pretty much 90% of the water from those sources comes from those two aquifers. There's a few wells that pump from geologic units that are below the Prairie du Chien Jordan. That's the Tunnel City and the Wanawak formations. And some wells pump from even deeper wells, go into the Mount Simon sandstone. And it may be hard to see this, but The picture on the left shows the Prairie du Chien in Jordan. That actually gets exposed at the surface, even though it's fairly deep here. It may be 300 feet in this area. You can actually see it exposed in Afton State Park. St. Peter sandstone, you can see this is bluff material that you can see along when you drive through St. Paul and some of the bluff areas along St. Paul. You can see the St. Peter sandstone. Now, when we talk about the domestic wells, it's a different picture. There are wells that are taking water from the Prairie du Chien and the Jordan Aquifer, but there are just as many wells taking water from St. Peter Sandstone Aquifer, and even some that are taking water from the glacial aquifers from above. So it's kind of a mixed picture. Now, why are the lake levels in some lakes low and others are not? And this is a diagram we came up with looking at lake level changes from 2004 to 2011. And you can see one lake in particular, one in the middle, the White Bear Lake, it's dropped more than 4 feet. It's actually dropped more than 6 feet since that time period. But there's other lakes in the area that have done similar. Turtle Lake, Snail Lake have had issues. I can show some of the plots here. Here's the White Bear Lake in the middle. Turtle Lake has dropped. It's come back up. But now since August, this past August, it's gone back down. And Birch Lake has also had issues, although it's recovered to some extent. But other lakes, South School section, I'll point out, that one has dropped more than 9 feet. And it hasn't recovered. It's still low. So what are the factors that kind of influence the lake levels? Well, there's a variety of factors. There's certain physical characteristics of lakes that can result in lake level changes. And also, you can look at the lake, you have to look at the water balance components. What are the sources and what are the sinks for water for a lake system? But then there's also human-induced factors, things like people can pump water into lakes or people can pump water out of lakes. And those are all factors that you have to consider when looking at why a lake level is going up or a lake level is going down. Now, some of the physical characteristics, the area, the size, the area and volume of the lakes. Lakes that are larger, sometimes they tend to hold more water and can withstand larger changes in the system. Whereas also you have to look at the watershed area or the area that contributes water to the lake. Lakes that have much larger watersheds can maybe can have more stable levels than lakes that have smaller watershed areas. For example, I'll give you an example, Bald Eagle Lake, that water level hasn't changed very much. Well, one reason why is the lake watershed is much larger than, for example, White Bear Lake. When you look at lakes, a lot of times they'll talk about the watershed area versus the lake area for a lake system. For Bald Eagle Lake, the watershed area to lake area ratio is about 10 to 1, whereas White Bear, it's only 2 to 1. So it's a much smaller watershed for White Bear Lake to get water from, whereas Bald Eagle is much larger. Other factors include our rivers, streams, and ditches. Are they connected to lakes? Because the lakes that have those can also withstand, can keep more stable water levels. Lakes that don't have ditches or rivers or streams connected, they're often called closed basin lakes, whereas lakes that have rivers or streams or ditches are called open basin. And finally, the groundwater connection. Is the lake connected to the groundwater system? How well is it connected? Is there a bunch of clay in between so the water from the groundwater doesn't feed into the lake very easily? Or is there a lot of sands so that the water can flow in? Okay, so when we talk about the lake water balance components, you have to look at all the factors involved. And you have to look at the inputs as well as the outputs. And the inputs are, you have precipitation, rainfall that can fall directly on the lake. But then you also have rainfall that can fall on the land surface and then run off into the lake, which is called surface runoff that can fall into the lake. You have evaporation off the lake that will take water off the lake. But then you also have plant transpiration. These are plants that are actually aquatic plants that are within the lake itself or ones that are along in the shorelines that can take water off the system. And those all have to be considered when looking at lake level changes. Also, you have to look at the groundwater system. Groundwater can flow into a lake, but lake water can also leave a lake and seep into an aquifer and leave this lake system. And one example of looking at groundwater and how it may flow into a lake, you can see a typical example here at White Bear Lake. If you go to the public beach, Matamidi Public Beach, you can actually see water that's seeping in along the shoreline. And you can see some of it looks like a rust colored to this system. And the reason why is that the groundwater that's coming in actually has a dissolved form of iron that's in the water. And the reason why it stays in there is because there's very little oxygen in the water. Well, once that water discharges along the shoreline, oxygen becomes available and the iron falls out of solution. And so you'll see these iron seeps. You can also see that by looking at temperature differences. And I know several people who I've talked with have always talked about swimming in White Bear Lake, and this is common with other lakes too, where they'll feel cold water in the summertime, really cool water in various locations. A lot of times those are places where you're getting groundwater flowing into the lake system. Now we said groundwater can flow into lakes, but also water can leave lakes and go into aquifer systems. And we have just completed a study on White Bear Lake, and one of the results we found is that we could see through water chemistry that wells that are nearby White Bear Lake actually have a mixture of surface water and groundwater coming into the lakes, going into the wells, excuse me. And so what we've seen is that water along the shores are discharging into White Bear Lake, but then there's also water that's flowing from the lake, seeping down, going into the deeper aquifer, which happens to be the Prairie Shane Jordan aquifer. And then when that mixes with the aquifer water, which is coming from the northeast, it can then flow to the south and actually get taken up by wells. And when those wells take in that water, we're seeing from the chemistry signature in the well water that it's a mixture of water, of surface water and groundwater. Why this is important is that pumping in the area since 1980 has doubled, and so we are increasing the amount of water we're taking from the aquifer. And some of this flow is natural. So you'll get a natural flow that may be coming down from the lake into the aquifer. But when we stress the aquifer, we're pulling out more water, we're dropping the water levels, we're increasing the amount of water that may be leaving the lake. So these are factors we all have to consider when we're looking at the lake level change. And I'd like to thank you all, and if you have any questions, I will be around.